Great Responsibility, Chapter 42, Lab Rats. Piper touched down, stumbling a bit as she did. The lab she'd landed in was dark and quiet. She let out a shaking breath. Okay, Piper, think. There has to be a way to get that thing off him without hurting him. The plan could work, but there was a noise from the closet to Piper's left, and she drew another incendiary arrow, knocking it into place. She carefully made her way to the door and kicked it in, ready to fire at what was most likely the thing that had been her best friend. But she didn't fire, because instead of venom, she found a mass of limbs in bright costumes she recognized as her team. She pulled White Tiger off the top of the pile as the boys began to sort themselves out. What the ever-loving hell are you guys doing here? Nova's helmeted head popped out from the bottom of the pile. We were trying to help you. But the window slammed shut and your invisible butler is anything but helpful. Piper rolled her eyes and pulled Power Man to his feet, letting Iron Fist flip to his. She held out a hand to Nova. He rolled his eyes, but let her help him up. Jarvis isn't an invisible butler. He's an AI system, and he probably doesn't recognize you. He's not programmed to help costumes he doesn't recognize. Piper heard something and slapped a hand over Nova's mouth. She grabbed a fire blanket from the shelf next to them and threw it over them, motioning for the others to hide. A hissing, shuffling sounded outside the door, and a deep growl echoed through the room. A tense moment passed. Then Venom lumbered past, the hissing breaths continuing. Piper kept her hand over Nova's mouth for another few tense breaths. Then she felt something warm and wet against her hand and jumped back, shaking her hand in disgust. Did you seriously just lick me? Nova shrugged slightly. Works on my little sister. Piper frowned. She hadn't known he had a sister. Look, whatever Fury sent you here to do, I got this. Piper could hear Ava's frown. Fury didn't send us. This was Nova's idea. Piper frowned, peeking out the door, keeping a careful eye on the shadows, waiting for one of them to start moving. Why? Nova shrugged, glad that his helmet covered his blush. You looked like you were in trouble, and we're a team. We help each other no matter what, even if one of us has been acting like a total flake lately. Piper flinched slightly as the others nodded. The bucket's right. You've been acting weird for a while. Weirder than normal, I mean. Piper sighed, her shoulders sagging as she remembered everything that was going on and everything she had planned to do today. The USB drive was still in her bag back at school in her locker. Danny laid a hand on her shoulder. You do not have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders, Spider. Share it, and it will lighten. Piper nodded slowly. Before glancing back out into the hallway, she sighed. I can't tell you everything now. Soon, I promise, but we need to stop Venom first. Ava nodded. Okay, who's in there? Piper made a face. She didn't want to tell them, but maybe Danny was right. Harry Osborn. The whole team winced. They all knew how close she and Harry were. Luke stepped forward. How do we stop him? Piper shook her head. That's where things get difficult. The only weakness we know that Venom has is electricity. I really don't want to electrocute my best friend if we can avoid it, but it's looking like that's unavoidable. We need to get to my dad's main lab. It's 2 floors up from here. The stairs are locked down, and as are the elevators. The quarantine protocol is supposed to keep the floors isolated, but the vents are still open between these 3 levels because there's no airborne pathogen. So we can use those to get around, but not out. Nothing can get out or in of these 3 levels while the quarantine is in effect. Ava nodded. Do you have a map of this place? It's huge. Piper nodded and stepped over to one of the tables. She tapped a button on the other side, and the table lit up. Piper swiped a hand over it, and an interface appeared, hovering above the table. Danny had to say he was impressed. The team had been fighting together for about a month and a half now, and Piper was already proving herself to be a born leader, both in and out of costume. He had a sneaking suspicion he knew why she wasn't in costume for this particular escapade. Sam was listening with more attention than he ever did when it was Fury or Coulson explaining the plan. He had a feeling that the hothead wasn't even going to go off the rails like he had on his first mission as leader. That was until Piper mentioned splitting up. "No way, Webbs. Splitting up is dumb." Piper cut him off. "Listen, Buckethead. We go in groups. You, Ava, and Danny as one. Me and Luke as the other. You and I are the only ones with long-distance attacks, and me and Ava are the only ones who can reprogram the equipment we need. Danny and Luke can punch through walls and floors, should we need it. Plus, Venom is fixated on me. Luke is the least likely to get hurt when we run up against him." Sam rolled his eyes as the others nodded. "Webbs is right. It's a smart plan," Luke said, stepping forward. "I just hope we don't hurt Harry." The others nodded. The group split as hissing breathing came back down the hall. The sound of spitting laughter and claws running along the walls echoed through the empty labs. Chapter 43. Backfire. It had been a good plan. It really had, but Piper had the sinking suspicion that Venom had overheard most, if not all of it. The symbiote was a lot smarter than she'd given it credit for. It had followed her and Luke, which she counted as a positive. Luke was practically indestructible, and better her than someone else had been her philosophy for a while now. Not that anyone knew that. Venom roared as it punched Luke through several walls, sending him sprawling. Piper drew a shock arrow and fired straight at Venom's face as Luke pulled himself to his feet 3 rooms away. Venom caught the arrow, and Piper pressed the button on the bow that activated the hardware. The black monster shrieked as electricity coursed through it. For a moment, the arrow snapped in its grip, and the mass of black sludge roiled as the charge in the arrow was spent. "Harry, I know you're in there. We're gonna get you out, I promise." Venom lashed out, and Piper didn't quite dodge in time. Claws bit into her side, and she went flying. Luke leapt just in time to catch her before she would have struck a wall. She swore as she felt something crawling around the wound. She flicked on the widow bite and punched herself in the side. She screamed as electricity coursed through her, and Luke watched, stunned, as the small amount of symbiote that had been attempting to crawl into the wound on her side evaporated. Piper struggled to her feet as the claw marks on her side dripped blood. She was still shaking from her self-electrocution. Natasha's widow bites packed more of a punch than she'd been expecting. Luke tossed her arm around his shoulder and ran, mostly carrying Piper away from Venom as it hissed, then roared, pulling itself back to its feet. Hopefully the others had reached the lab. Sam blasted the door off the lab and frowned. There had been nothing to get in their way as they made their way up 2 floors worth of vents. Not even a peep. This place was creepy, no matter how cool it was. It didn't help that the last time he'd been at Stark Tower, he'd almost lost a team member. The image of Piper, sans costume, falling out the window of Stark Tower with a scream was not something he'd soon forget. There was no one in the lab when they reached it, so Ava began to pull apart the bottom of the console Piper had told her about. Nova tapped his foot midair. "They should be here by now." Danny nodded. "I agree. Piper knows this place much better than we do." There was a roar that shook the whole building, and Sam and Danny froze. Ava was still frantically working under one of the tables. There was silence for a moment. Ticking on, it felt like forever. A scream echoed off the walls, and Sam made to move for the door. Danny grabbed his foot. "The spider was very specific that we shouldn't go after her." "She knows what she's doing." Sam frowned. "Does she, though?" The door to the lab burst open, and Luke came barreling through, supporting a nearly unconscious Piper. She looked up, her eyes slightly glassy, and Sam swore, flying over to them and hesitating. The gashes on her side were bad. A trail of blood led the way they'd come, and her shirt was trash. She shrugged herself off Luke's arm and snatched up a Bunsen burner off of one of the tables. Ignoring her injury, she flipped to the top of the table and flicked the burner on, and one of the sockets in the ceiling Sam hadn't noticed. An alarm blared and a set of metal doors descended, a large radioactive symbol on them, in front of both doors to the lab. Once they were in place, Piper sighed and sat down hard on the table, wobbling slightly. Sam swore, getting a better look at her injuries in the red blaring lights. It was deep and singed around the edges. Solo lab quarantine. I wasn't sure it would work, since I've already isolated these 3 floors. Luke nodded at her.
I'm not sure that's gonna hold him, though.
Piper nodded. Probably not, but it'll buy us a few minutes. She took a deep breath and hopped off the table, swearing under her breath as she jostled her injury. Sam made to help her, but she shook her head at him and ducked under the table with Ava. There was a few minutes of tense silence before the floor underneath them shook and the test tubes rattled. Another second of silence, then another boom. Several tubes fell to the floor and shattered. Then a different kind of boom sounded, and Piper froze, calling out from under the table where she and Ava were rewiring something. Sam hadn't really understood the plan. Jarvis, was that a repulsor blast? The AI's voice was still not coming from a source Sam could find. Yes, Miss Parker. The Avengers are attempting to breach the quarantine protocol. Piper swore and moved again, a litany of curses in different languages floating from under the table. Put me through to Dad, now! Sam was about to protest when the staticky voice he recognized from their field trip, not even a week ago, came over the speakers.
Piper, are you okay? We're trying to get in.
Piper swore as she moved again. No, whatever you do, do not break the quarantine. If you do, this thing gets loose and the whole city is in danger. The response was almost immediate.
What thing?
Piper swore as a shower of sparks forced Ava out from under the console. The thing from Harry's party is back. I don't know what it is. It calls itself Venom. There was an angry gasp over the speakers. I'm gonna vaporize it! Piper stuck 2 wires together with a frown. No, you can't. There's a person in that thing. I have a plan. The floor shook again. This time it cracked, and the black mass that was Venom began to seep through, tearing off chunks of the floor as it went.
Piper, don't you dare take this thing on alone.
Sam swore and grabbed Luke and Danny off the floor as it began to collapse under them. Who said I was alone? Her grin was strained as she connected the last 2 wires. Tiger, the jumper cables we need, in that cabinet. Ava leapt from table to table, trying to evade the sea of wiggling blackness that was tearing the floor apart in the middle of the room. She barely made it to the top of the cabinet, ripping the door off and grabbing the jumper cables, throwing them across the room to Piper as Tony Stark continued to freak out over the speakers and the alarm kept blaring. Piper dove back under the console as, with a triumphant roar, Venom pulled itself into the room, and the repulsor fire grew louder and more concentrated. Sam shot a blast at Venom, but the large creature wasn't paying him any attention. Instead, it grabbed Piper by her legs and yanked, pulling her out from under the console with a surprised cry. Tony shouted over the speakers, but Piper wasn't listening. Sam spotted the jumper cables connected to the base of the devices around Piper's wrists. Give him back, you son of a bitch! She shouted as she drove her fists into Venom's arms, activating the widow bites as she did. Lightning arced around the room as Venom shrieked and bubbled. A much more feminine scream of pain sounded under the inhuman screech, and Sam made to lunge forward, but another arc of lightning stopped him. Then the black mass evaporated and the lightning stopped. The lights in the lab had gone out. The sound of rending metal was horrible, and each of them clapped their hands to their ears as the quarantine wall to their left was torn apart like it was made of wrapping paper. A large, green, angry figure stood there, seemingly ready to rip anything that displeased him apart like he had the wall. Light poured in, and the team finally spotted Piper. She was laying, bleeding on the floor, out cold. Harry Osborn had landed next to her. He was starting to stir. A flash of red and gold flew past the Hulk and landed next to Piper. His hands hovered over her wounds for a moment before he turned to the Hulk.
Big guy, I know you're upset, but she needs Bruce right now.
The Hulk huffed and looked like he was going to roar again, but then he spotted the blood pooling under Piper. He whimpered and began to shrink. Moments later, Bruce Banner was standing shirtless, holding his torn pants in one hand, blinking slightly before spotting Piper and rushing forward. He shoved Tony out of the way to check over his patient. Danny made a step forward to explain what he could, but a hand landed on his shoulder, and he looked up into the face of the Black Widow. She shook her head at him.
You can tell us what happened later. They need to focus right now.
Danny nodded. There was a noise that the Hulk had made, and seconds later Hawkeye was rushing in, closely followed by Thor carrying Captain America. The team would have been starstruck under better circumstances. There was a groan, and Harry sat up, rubbing his head.
What happened?
He looked around, blinking confusedly for a moment before he spotted Piper and choked out a scream. Hawkeye grabbed him by the shoulder before he could make it to her. Harry was shaking from head to toe.
I didn't do that, did I?
A voice came from the hole in the wall.
We'll figure it out, son. For the moment, you need to come with me.
Everyone save Bruce and Tony turned to the voice and saw Nick Fury standing in the debris.